Hello and welcome. In this video, we will be getting started with Bicep. And what is Bicep, you might ask? Well, it's infrastructure as a code language used to deploy stuff in Azure. So it's specific to Azure. It won't be able to use it to deploy stuff in AWS, for example, but it is a really cool tool to have, and it's rather powerful. It can be a bit daunting to start with Bicep, start learning Bicep. And I find that the best approach is probably not to, sit down with your Azure infrastructure and go, I'm going to convert this all to Bicep, and then open up a code editor or notepad or what have you. And then I'm going to write this all manually by hand with no assistance. That is a bad idea. The better approach is to use the tools that are available freely to everyone. And that is what we will be doing today. We'll use Visual Studio Code, we'll use the Bicep extension, and from there we'll start creating code. So what I have prepared is a blank Windows 11 machine. It's just the OS, nothing else on it. And we will start by actually installing Visual Studio Code. And I will have the link to this down in the description, but you'll probably also find it quite easily if you just do a simple Google search for install Visual Studio Code. So yeah, and I'll be using the user installer, and I have x64, so I'll use that link. Click on it, and I will have the installer downloaded. Then open the installer, and this is okay for me. I'll accept the agreement, hit next, 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 and install. Pretty simple install in this setup. Then we'll launch Visual Studio Code. And then we'll head on over to the extensions on the side here. And then I'll search for Bicep and hit the install button. And then I'll head on back to the Explorer and let us open up a folder. Let's create a new folder, call this just Bicep. It's a beautiful name for a folder. Select folder, and now we are actually ready to start creating files. So we have the Bicep folder here. We can click the new file button, and let us just call this main.bicep. .bicep is the file extension for Bicep files. So let's close this welcome page. And now we are actually ready to start writing the Bicep code. And the Bicep extension for Visual Studio Code really comes in handy here, because if I simply write something like VM, then there's a lot of suggestions here. Like, for example, the res VM Windows. Clicking that will actually populate a bunch of Bicep code for deploying a virtual machine. So you can use that sort of things to aid you in learning Bicep. There's a lot of good examples this way. I find that they tend to be a bit old, these suggestions. For example, see, this is using an API version of 2020, so it's fairly old. Instead, let us do this all manually, and we'll start by stating that we want to create a resource. So start typing resource. They will show up as a suggestion, just resource, and then we need to give it a name. This is not the name that will show up in the Azure portal. This is the variable name that will be used within the context of these Bicep files. So in my case, I can do simply VM, then hit space, and now we need to select the resource type. So in our case, we will do a virtual machine. And there's a lot of suggestions here, but we need to scroll on down until we see Microsoft.compute/virtual machines. And then we're given a whole list of dates to select, and these are actually the versions of the APIs. So if you're unsure what to choose, selecting the latest one is usually a safe bet. So clicking that, then space, and then we grab the suggestion of equals, space again, and then let us select the required properties. That will pre-populate these two, name and location, which are both required. There's a bunch more that's required as well, but let's start with those two. The name here is the actual name that the resource will get in the Azure portal. So that's the name you will see. And this needs to be, properly formatted. This also needs to be within quotation marks, so just do quotation, and we'll use North Europe for now. You see this yellow squiggly line. That is caused by the fact that I have hard-coded this now as North Europe instead of using a variable, which is the recommendation. We will be sticking to hard-coding stuff for now, but let me know in the comments if you want to see a step 2 of, or part 2 of this video where I show you stuff like variables. And yeah, so we'll stick with North Europe as the location for now. And then the neat thing is that if you just hit spacebar, you get a list of what you can select next. So I will select the properties because we need to set some properties on our VM, and then hit spacebar again, and you see that the top one here is the square squiggly brackets. I'll select that. And now, again, spacebar, and I'll get a list of what I need to select from. So I know that I need to go within the hardware profile to set the size of the VM. So I'll click the hardware profile, and then space again. And you see that it suggests the squiggly brackets. Let's use those. Again, spacebar, and let us select the VM size. Space, and here we get a full list of sizes to select from. So let us scroll on down to the D series, and let's do a D8S. That's fine. You might have noticed that this list is not a particularly updated one. It is rather old. You can't select the V5, for example. So I can go in and just swap that out for a V5. And now I will get a DS8S version 5 VM. All right, that is all I need for the hardware profile, but we need to also do some stuff within the OS profile, the operating system profile. So scrolling down to OS profile. Again, I did a spacebar to get this list up. Select OS profile, space, click the squiggly brackets, spacebar yet again. And I know that we need to set a computer name, and this will be the name within the guest operating system. I find that it's pretty wise to use the same as the name in the Azure portal. You may select something else if you want to, but I suggest you use the same one. And I also know that we need a admin username. So I'll go with Peter Tech for now. And again, space, and I'll get this list. I'll select the admin password, and we'll set a long and strong password for this VM. You see now that the indentation is a bit off. That's because I'm using that space to get that list of selections, but you can then go ahead and remove those spaces so you get things nice and organized yet again. All right, so that's all we need for the OS profile. We also need the storage profile. Yeah, so again, spacebar, get the list, start writing what you want to select. I'll select storage profile, space, and the squiggly brackets. Within the storage profile is where we define the image that we want to base our VM on. So we need to define the publisher, the offer, the SKU, and the version. So space, and okay, image reference, cool. Space, squiggly brackets, cool. Space, and publisher, cool. Now, you don't get a selection here, but for a Windows server-based VM, it will always be Microsoft Windows Server. That's the publisher. As for the offer, this would be the Windows Server. Again, you don't get a selection list here, which is kind of sad, but you can find this by prodding through the PowerShell commands for getting the image offers and stuff like that. And we also needed the SKU, which would, well, let's use the Windows Server 2022. So 2022 dash data center. And then the version would be latest. Sorry, we need the quotation marks here as well. And let's just clean up the indentations here. That's a bit better. So that is all we need for the storage profile. Next, I know that we need to reference a network interface card. That is done in the network profile. Space, squiggly brackets, and then we can use space to get the lists and select the network interfaces, space, and then square brackets. And again, space, because you can have multiple network interfaces. That is the reason why these are in square brackets as opposed to squiggly or curly brackets. Within network interfaces, the first one, we need to reference the ID of a network interface card. And that means that we need to create the network interface card before we create the VM. So what we will do now is to scroll on back to the top of our Bicep file and add a couple of more lines at the top, and then we'll start creating our virtual machine network interface card. So again, we'll do a resource, call this just NIC, because again, this is a variable that is only used within the context of this Bicep file. Then space, and we get the list of all the resources we can create. In our case, we will be using creating a network interface. So Microsoft.network/network interfaces, click that. And again, we are prompted with a lot of dates. We select the latest one. We want to use the latest API. Space, and accept the equals suggestion, space again, and then do the required properties. And the name, again, this is the name that will show up in the Azure portal, the actual resource name. I'll just call it lab VM NIC for now. And then we always need to have the location. And again, we'll use North Europe. And then we need to set some properties for our virtual network interface card. So let us do properties. Again, I could use space and just get the whole list of supported selections and then click properties. But now I'm getting a bit comfortable. I can just start typing the name of the property I want to add. Hit space, curly brackets, and then within the properties, we need to add IP configurations to our interface. So IP, and then select the IP configurations. Hit the spacebar. Now there's square brackets because we could have multiple IP configurations per network interface card. And then within the IP configurations, again, we could hit space and get a list of suggestions. So, okay, curly brackets. This would be the first of our IP configurations. And we need a name for it. And let's just call this IP config 1. And we also need to define a couple of properties. Again, you could do space and get a list of all available suggestions and then just click properties. Fixing the indentation, then space. Okay, we need some curly brackets. And within the properties, you need to, well, let's see. There's a whole lot of things you can do here. But we want to select the subnet to which this network interface card will be connected. So let's click subnet, hit space, and curly brackets is the suggestion, so fine. And space, and ID, okay. ID, cool. This is the same as we saw with the network interface card for our VM. This needs to be created before we create the network interface card. So again, we'll go to the top and add a couple of more lines. And then we'll create the VNet that we will connect to. So we'll do a resource and call this VNet. Again, this is a variable within the context of this bicep file, it's not the name that will show up in the portal. And this time we will be deploying a resource of type virtual network. Again, there's a whole lot of suggestions here. We do not want the SCVMM. We want the Microsoft.network/virtual networks. So I'll click that, select the latest API, hit space, accept equals, and space, and then do the required properties yet again. And the name, and the name for this would be simply VNets. We need to do the location. That's still going to be North Europe. And then we need to set some properties. That is kind of a theme here. You see all of the resources you need: name, location, and you need some properties. So the properties that we need to set for our VNets is we need to first do a space and get this curly brackets, and then we need to add in, let's see, address space. Okay, so space, curly brackets, fine, space, okay, address prefixes, and now we have some square brackets, meaning that within here we can have multiple ones, but we'll use, we'll go for a single one for now. So let's do 10.13.37.0/24, which is, kind of a default size of a VNet. So that's the address prefix, the address space for our VNet, and we now need to add some subnets. So new line after address spaces, and let's see what is the list here. So yeah, here we have subnets. Hit space again, and square brackets, meaning we probably can have multiple subnets, and spacebar and the curly brackets. Okay, so within the first subnet, we need to define a name, probably. Yeah, name. And this would be lab subnets. And what else than name? We have some properties. Okay, cool. A spacebar, curly brackets, spacebar again. So probably select some address prefixes here as well. And this will be, well, let's do the entire address space. It's fine. Right, so I think we now have all we need to create the VNet. These are not all options you have in terms of specifying properties for your VNet, but this is a bare minimum of what you need to specify. And now we can use, since this is all in order, it will process this resource first, meaning it will create the VNet first. And since this is a variable, we can reference that later on. So when the VNet is created, it gets a bit more, a whole lot more properties on it. Among other things, the ID. So if we scroll down to our NIC now, and on our ID, if we go back and then hit space, you can see that our VNet is now shown as an option. So if I click the VNet and then add a punctuation mark, and you can select the stuff from that VNet. And this all references the same kind of setup that we have here. You know what? You have the properties, for example. Within that, you have some subnets and so on and so on. So I'll select properties and then another punctuation, and we'll scroll down to subnets, and we will specify that we want to use the first one. So we'll do square brackets and 0. That will reference the first one of the subnets in that VNet. But you see that the Visual Studio Code is not happy yet. They are a yellow squiggly bracket because, as if I hover over, you see that it expected a value of null or a string. So, okay, I'll hit another punctuation. And here you can see that we now have an ID for property of our subnet. So if I click that, it's all happy. So now we have referenced the ID of the first subnet within the properties of that VNet. And we can also then do the exact same thing for our VM, which needed an ID for the network interface. So hit spacebar, and then select the nick, punctuation, and ID. And it's all happy. And this is actually all you need for a simple bicep template. But we have only now written the code. We also need to deploy it. And to do that, we need to install Bicep as well as a couple of PowerShell modules. The easiest way is probably to use Winget, but for the sake of this demo, let us do it through the manual download of the Bicep installer. So I'll go on to the Bicep documentation. Again, link is in the description, but you'll also find it quite easily if you Google it. And we need to scroll on down to the manual install, and for Windows, download and run the latest Windows installer. Let's click that. Open it up. Accept the agreement. Next. Install. Then finish. Then we can open up our terminal. Actually, let me make this a tad bigger for you guys. So like so. That's a bit better. We also need to install a couple of PowerShell modules. So we'll do install module. And the first thing we need is the az.accounts. And for simplicity's sake, it's often wise to do a scope and then add the current user as the scope, so you don't need admin privileges to install these modules. So I'll run that. And yeah, yes to that as well. And we also need the az.resources. Yes. And let's clean this up for a bit. And then we can now get into our folder where we stored our Bicep files. And then we need to actually connect to Azure. So we'll do connect az account and sign in with our user account. Hop back into our terminal, and then we could do a new -az resource group deployment. And this will need a name. Suggest you do different names for each deployment. But for now, let's just use the first. And then we need to have a resource group name. In my case, I have created a one called rg-bicep demos. So I'll use that. And we have a need to select the template file. And that would be our main.bicep. And if we try to run this now, you can see the same kind of warnings that I got in Visual Studio Code about North Europe being a hard-coded location. That is still fine. Also that the admin username should use a parameter. That's also fine in our case right now. And yeah, the deployment should now be on its way. And after a while, you can see that our provisioning was succeeded. So if I get over to the Azure portal, and you can see that I now have a couple of resources within my resource group. So that means that we have now successfully created our Bicep template, this whole shebang here, and we have also successfully deployed that Bicep template to Azure. And yeah, that wasn't all too hard, was it? So let me know in the comments if you want a part 2 of this, where we go more in depth in doing cool stuff within Bicep, modules, parameters, and all that sorts of stuff. Another thing you can do is actually to head on over to my Twitch channel, where I work a lot on Bicep templates and stuff like that live, and I'll show you stuff and be able to answer any questions you may have over there. So that's twitch.tv/PetterTech. Link is, of course, also in the description. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you around later on. Cheers.